see when we look at the political report that much of what was considered a nation, even when Stalin defined the nation according to his criteria, did not exist for most of Europe anyway. It was a concept more than anything else. Say the United Nations, the UNIA rather, 1920 convention held in Madison Square Garden and attended by from 25,000 to 50,000 Africans was arguably the most democratic African event since African colonial slavery. Garvey was elected by a provisional president of Africa, and the colors of red, black, and green were democratically chosen as the national colors of the dispersed African nation. These were chosen not as the colors of Nigeria or Harlem. These were determined to be by 25,000 to 50,000 African people who had come to New York in 1920 and made this determination, voted on this democratically.
What page are you on?
I'm not on any page. I'm going through, I'm overviewing what's in both of these. So we say that national identity has objective and subjective elements. I'm overviewing, first of all, chapter 4 on the national question. National identity has objective and subjective elements. We say there is a sense of sameness that exists between black people throughout the world. Sometimes where there is only a distant connection to Africa by some that precedes colonial slavery. And when I say a distant connection, I'm talking about Australia, I'm talking about places in India and other places in Asia where there is a sense of sameness when we are aware of the existence of each other. We recognize there is a false national consciousness that responds to the imposition of colonial authority, borders, and definitions, that it confuses Africans and others around this question of who we are. Hence, we say, and this is a quote from the text, hence we say that the African nation is one born of its historical tie to Africa, its national homeland, and with a core sense of sameness that includes a common culture, history, and physiognomy, unquote. Historical necessity responds to the fact that the consolidation of the African nation is a prerequisite for overturning the abject genocidal condition of existence of Africans everywhere. And then in this text that I have from page, beginning especially with page 104, I just wanted to share something with you. And I'm hoping everybody would have the political report, because it is a study that we're doing. But where we make the point, I'm going to read extensively here. We say that, and this addresses the question that this also is a part of this discussion concerning the fact that historical necessity is something that the African nation responds to. It's coming into being as a response to historical necessity. You say that, in fact, the European or white nation is a creature that acquired its sense of sameness as part of the oppressed nation, oppressor nation dialectic. Hence we can say that the African nation is one born of its historical tie to Africa, its national homeland, and with a core sense of sameness that includes a common culture, history, and physiognomy. Still, to define the African nation, we must say more than this. It is true that the African nation is also informed by historical necessity, by what our conditions of existence are at this very moment, hundreds of years subsequent to our defining conflict with the European predator nation, whose parasitic attachment to Africa and Africans shapes and determines both its successful existence and our national incoherence. A critical feature of our conditions of existence as a people is the imperialist near total control of the economic life of Africa and African people wherever we are located in the world. Neither Africa, the land, nor Africans, the people, fundamental components of the productive forces, have been accessible to Africa for the creation and recreation of real life for Africa and Africans. Hence, Africa has created immense wealth for imperialism that has benefited the entire European nation, ruling class, workers, and others at our expense. Therefore, it is historical necessity, the absolute requirement of any people to create and recreate real life as a condition for existence that requires the consolidation of the African nation. The consolidation of the African nation is a prerequisite for overturning the abject, genocidal conditions of existence of Africans everywhere. There is no separate solution for the liberation of African people based on the colonially defined borders. Clearly, the African liberation movement has run into its limitations when fought within the context of these borders. Civil rights and flag independence only serve to obscure our oppressive exploitation, not overturn it. Millions of Africans have been forcibly dispersed from Africa throughout the world. Europeans and others have come to Africa, some as colonizers, some as subjects of colonial powers who were allowed privilege in Africa as intermediary colonial agents functioning as buffers, contributing to absolute African dependency and the atrophy of African productive forces. What I'm saying here simply is that a lot of white people came there as oppressors, and then they also brought other people like Asians, and particularly Lebanese, Indians, and stuff like that, who function sort of like as middle people, whose role, like where Africans were denied even resources on our own land, to develop any kind of productive, independent production, these forces were able to do that. That meant that African people never came into control of our own productive capacity. Even our ability to, like, you go to most places in Africa, especially this is true, well, most places, you will find that even supermarkets are not owned by even the African middle class. And they're owned by Lebanese, they're owned by other forces who have come from India and places like that. These people did not come, they came to Africa in most instances as subjects to British or some other colonialism. They were brought into Africa, they were allowed to make a whole bunch of resources, but one of the functions of that was to deny any kind of independent African development, economic development. And also it served to atrophy the development of the productive forces in Africa. For example, even in communities that we live in places outside of Africa, in this country, for example, where Africans cannot easily, at one time, there was a bit of independent economic development where Africans locally were actually owners of small businesses and things like that that came under major assault, consistent with what the emergence of what they characterize as integration. Now the African middle class has been neutered, more or less, and we have and unable to even get resources for any kind of independent economic capacity, and instead those resources would go to forces who come into our communities from and sometimes from colonized countries or semi-colonial countries themselves. In these communities you will find Palestinian shops, you will find Indian shops, you will find motels and other things, and African people, the African middle class even doesn't even have the ability to develop, which means that they can't hire people in their own communities, among other things, but also means that you have a cowardly, spineless middle class, petty bourgeois middle class that has no sense of patriotism toward African people, since it has no relationship to African people that it has to depend on for its own livelihood. It depends instead on a livelihood from its connection with imperial white power, either white folks downtown or some other entity, as opposed to a relationship with the African working and pressed people ourselves. So, and the point is that the same thing happened, you know, throughout the African world. I don't know if people remember the era of Idi Amin, who became much adored by, incorrectly so, by a lot of Africans because he kicked the Asians. He took their businesses and kicked them out and what have you, because they function in many ways. Their attitudes and were imperialist attitudes that they had adopted from the colonial powers who had brought them there, you know, sometimes a century earlier. and functioning as middle persons who owned all the businesses at the expense of the African population and treated the African people with a certain kind of contempt. Just as that same thing happens in the communities in the United States, where we find a similar kind of relationship. So we say that other occupants of Africa are descendants of Arab conquest in Africa preceding that